collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosi Charalambous.
KISA, the local NGO for equality support and anti-racism, organised an event recently at which there were several speakers from across Europe. Access rights for migrants and refugees in Cyprus was the title of the conference, and on the first panel of the afternoon, one of the speakers was the representative of the UNHCR in Cyprus. She is Katja Saha, and she joins us now. Katja, you were talking about protection challenges in Cyprus, particularly in the context of the regional crisis. What did you mean by that? What are the challenges, and are they different here from in other places?
The challenges, I would say that the first challenge for any refugee or an asylum seeker in any given country is the public opinion. So without welcoming communities and without favourable public opinion, it is extremely difficult for anybody to feel welcomed and to be able to start a new life.
And that means that if they're not feeling welcomed, I suppose the trauma, particularly if they've come from a war zone, continues because they're never quite sure how they're going to be treated.
Absolutely, and this is the other issue that is very high on our agenda here in Cyprus. It's how to identify the most vulnerable individuals when they come. So we strongly encourage the government to put in place this kind of an early identification system so that those individuals who really have severe traumas or suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, they do receive adequate counselling and adequate assistance for their special needs.
And how easy is it to identify the particularly vulnerable?
Well, some vulnerabilities are visible disabilities, but some are not. So it is extremely difficult. It is not just by looking at the person or asking how did you or did you go through a trauma that you will identify someone. And one of the symptoms of the post-traumatic stress disorder is also the fact that the person will have difficulties answering questions in a logical manner. So it makes the identification even more difficult. So yes, you do need specialized staff to go through this kind of interviews.
So how do other countries handle this? Does it mean that when the application is made and the first contact is made with the authorities here dealing with an asylum request, that there should, for example, be a psychologist present?
Not necessarily psychologist, ideally yes, but I mean vulnerabilities can be anything. They can be medical vulnerabilities, or they can be just simply young mother alone with a number of children, or it can be a trauma. So it really depends on the type of vulnerability, or it might be a sexual orientation that makes the person very vulnerable in a certain environment. So it's a skill that we teach how to we can help with checklists. What are the questions to be asked, and what normally happens is when the person first approaches either an immigration police officer or a social worker or whomever it is, somebody who works for the asylum service, whoever is the first person in line to receive asylum seekers, this person will need to have these skills.
Let's assume they've got those skills. One of the things that came out of the panel was the backlog of applications and the length of time it is taking the authorities here to deal with them. That's not doing the asylum seeker any favour, but it's also not doing Cyprus any favours either. How do we get over that problem?
Well, I hope that we are getting over that problem. Actually, the number is 8,000 individuals who are waiting for final decisions for their asylum claims. I think it's a situation that needs to be addressed at the first instance, first by putting in place accelerated procedures. Half of those who seek asylum in Cyprus come from countries that do not traditionally produce refugees. So for these population groups, people who come from countries such as India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and others who might not have international protection needs, they should not come to this process at all. So there are systems that can be put in place to identify these kind of cases, what we call that are clearly not well-founded cases, and to have a very quick determination and a final decision for their cases.
And what happens to them if they are, in a sense, not entitled to asylum or refugee status?
Then that's a migration migration management issues. So there are other organizations who offer, for example, IOM, who offer voluntary return packages for these kind of individuals. But what is of interest to us, to UNHCR, is that these systems, the asylum system, quickly responds to those who do have protection needs. And this means that there also needs to be accelerated procedures to identify those, first of all, like I said, those who are vulnerable, who cannot wait for years to be addressed because of the distress that they are experiencing. And then there are others who are clearly refugees, like people who are coming from Syria. They are refugees just for the fact of being Syrians because they are fleeing a war. So these individuals also should go through accelerated procedures and have a very quick response. And this would just leave a number of individuals who come from countries that do produce refugees, but that decision needs to be taken after a careful individual examination of the asylum claims, like people from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Iraq, some countries in Africa, and they could go through these regular procedures that at the moment are applied for everyone.
Right, let's talk for a moment about Syrians, because they tend to be the majority with what's been going on in our neighbouring country. And it seems to me from the figures that I've seen, certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, that the tendency in Cyprus seems to be to give Syrian asylum seekers subsidiary protection. And that is not the same thing, is it? Can you explain the difference and whether or not that, in fact, prevents them from, in a sense, moving on?
Well, there is a big difference, but that is mainly one difference between refugees and those who receive subsidiary protection in Cyprus, and that is the fact that those with subsidiary protection are not entitled for family reunification. And this is the big reason. 95% of Syrians who come to Cyprus to seek asylum, they are considered who receive then subsidiary protection status, and this means that these individuals are unable to have their families join them in legal way in Cyprus.
And so is that fair?
It is not in UNHCR's policy. We do recommend the government to give Syrians refugee status because for us they are refugees. There are 2 countries in Europe who have this policy, and it is Malta and Cyprus. As there are some other countries that do put some kind of limits, for example, that those who are considered subsidiary protection beneficiaries, they will need to wait 1, 2 or 3 years before they can have their family members join them. But there are only 2 countries, Malta and Cyprus, who do not allow any kind of a legal family unification.
And it seems that probably that's because we're hoping as soon as things calm down in Syria that they'll go back where they came from.